For those that have joined us, thank you for joining one of the ASI webinar series. My name is Mark Annandale. I'm advisor to the Indigenous Peoples Advisory Forum. This webinar is going to talk about the bigger picture of what the Indigenous Peoples Advisory Forum is, how it operates, and provide some examples of some of the work that IPAF has done and is in process of doing. So this month of August, on the 9th of August, it's the UN International Day of the World's Indigenous Peoples, and to acknowledge and recognise that, ASI is having a series of discussions with regard to the Indigenous Peoples Advisory Forum. And in that process, we're going to share stories on our website, on some of our social media, and have some discussions about some of the activities that are ongoing. Today, we're going to talk a bit about some of the specific projects in Norway, India, Guinea, Ghana, and Australia, as well as some of the positive work that's happening in Suriname and has been for a couple of years. As part of the additional work on what ASI is doing, a webinar coming up soon on August the 17th that'll be facilitated by Dr. Penda Diallo, the Qualitative Research Manager for ASI, where Penda will be having a discussion with regards to some of her project work in Guinea, which was focused on understanding the perception of local and rural communities in bauxite mining regions within Guinea. So some of the activities in the aluminium value chain that may impact on Indigenous peoples and local communities are highlighted in green on this map. And we do interchange and use both Indigenous peoples and local communities, because in some countries and some regions, people don't identify as being Indigenous, but do identify as being from local communities. So we use both to acknowledge some of those differences. So all of the work within ASI is within the ASI strategy, and there are priorities and pillars within the sustainability priorities, and much of our work is in the beyond certification pillar within those strategic pillars. I won't go into those details because you can find it more on our website. So the Indigenous Peoples Advisory Forum is a key part of the ASI governance system, and the IPAF provide a whole lot of inputs to ASI, and that includes specialist knowledge and recognition of development and support. We have a number of registered specialists that are from Indigenous communities and or local communities. And for example, 2 registered specialists from Guinea provide input and support for audits, and to date have done 2 audits, and they also undertake mentoring and capacity building of other IPAF members in Guinea. So we're increasingly supporting and further developing capacity within various countries to support further engagement and participation within the aluminium supply chain. So there's been a number of Indigenous-led projects, and we're going to discuss those in more detail. And we're going to talk a bit about more broad community level capacity building, and have a bit of a discussion about the complaints process. So IPAF is essentially a communications and engagement platform, and it's to support and facilitate communications between Indigenous peoples in different locations, and to provide support and a means of that engagement. So there's increasingly support, discussion and various other forms of communication between Indigenous peoples and local communities in different countries that have developed relationships through IPAF and are now increasingly supporting each other, addressing shared and common challenges when dealing with the sector. The IPAF representatives play a key role within the ASI governance framework, and that includes representation on the Standards Committee and various working groups, and they have direct engagement on an annual basis with the ASI board and participate in the ASI complaints mechanism. And as I said before, including engagement with each other and between each of the groups. This is a picture of a Norwegian, this is the German reindeer, and it's a reindeer's eye. The aim being of this is to talk about the fact that we have a range of perspectives and people look at the world through different lenses, and we support Indigenous people sharing their views, their worldviews and their perspective on different matters, and help further inform and build capacity of ASI, ASI members, the Secretariat and certified entities, so that we build that knowledge sharing and that capacity more broadly. This is a copy of a report that IPAF members developed in review of the standards when the version 2 of the standards was up for review, which took about a year. IPAF members and IPAF representatives considered the standard during that review process and provided a comprehensive set of inputs into the review process, and all of those inputs, considerations, advice and suggestions were accepted by the Standards Committee, and it was a very positive and insightful process. These are a series of pictures of IPAF meetings. Pre-COVID, IPAF would meet annually in a different location for IPAF members to directly meet and discuss the issues at hand and hear firsthand from communities in each of the locations to better understand some of the issues and challenges faced by those communities, and again, to share some common stories and ways of addressing those. So this photo is here of a meeting at the Gulkula mine, the only Indigenous owned and operated bauxite mine in the world. We've got a meeting in India, in the Jharkhand state, with a couple of these other photos. There's been meetings in Suriname, which are represented in these photos. And there's been a meeting in Malaysia and some other locations. Since COVID, we've gone to the more remote options for engagement, and that includes through Zoom and from time to time, face-to-face meetings based on projects. We've got a couple of slides of bauxite mines. Here is a mine just showing the scale of impacts and the landscape view of bauxite mining. Here's a couple of other images where this is the operational activities within bauxite mining, clearing the vegetation. Generally it's windrowed and burnt, and then the soil is stripped, put aside for future rehabilitation purposes, and then the bauxite is extracted. This is an image of bauxite mine rehabilitation preparations. The dark strip of soil in the foreground is the topsoil spread out. The piles just behind it in the triangle shape are stockpiles of soils representing the original soil horizons that were removed from that bauxite mining area. These soils will be spread out the ground will be ripped and then sown with seed or planted directly with seedlings. These images are from Northern Australia in the Cape York Peninsula, and it's to show some examples of Indigenous activities before mining, where the Indigenous communities are extracting forest resources before mine activities, and this is several years, even to a decade ahead of mine clearing operations, where high value timbers are selectively harvested and then stockpiled so that they can be processed as part of these Indigenous businesses. This includes a large barge load of high-grade timber being shipped to a regional centre where it's further processed by Indigenous people and developed into high-value products. So this photo shows the timber that's salvaged from mining leases and put into a construction in Queensland. This is a photo in Arnhem Land at the bauxite mining lease areas there. This is Indigenous housing where they're utilising timber salvaged from mining leases and put into local construction. So as you can see, high value timber products. These are some images of local infrastructure where the same species are utilised, and this is in remote homelands within the Indigenous communities of Arnhem Land, and includes training on how to construct these shelters, which are used for recreational and ceremonial purposes. We've got a couple of images here of old sawmilling operations associated with mining operations and local communities, also in Northern Australia. These images are around the 1950s and 1960s, and just a reminder that many of the things we do, we've got to learn from the past and come back to some of those learnings and implement some things that have already been done. This is an old sawmill in Cape York Peninsula where the Indigenous peoples through the mission times built their own houses. This is the start of a prefab house, and these small houses, they're in the modern language, they're called tiny houses, and built out of local resources that the Indigenous people built and lived in and suited the local environment. There's lots of support through ASI for training, and that can be ASI specific training where we look at support for IPAF members to better understand the aluminium value chain, ASI governance, and there's a number of other programs that are available on ASI website in Educational that is available to members and other stakeholders to undertake and do online. But we further develop those training opportunities and deliver a more bespoke training delivery for Indigenous peoples in different countries, including in French and English, to support increased training and increased awareness. Excuse me. Some of the other training that we help support or facilitate is around project activities, and that can be around data collection, data management, assessment of resources ahead of mine clearing operations in support of collection and harvest of materials for local community livelihood support, but also for support of mine rehabilitation to further establish options for livelihoods in mine closure. So these are just examples of Indigenous communities participating in seed collection, learning the seed handling and propagation and those sorts of activities. There's a few images here of non-timber forest products and their collection from mining lease areas, again, ahead of mining operations, so as there's not direct interaction with people on mine sites in active areas, but again, to harvest those materials for livelihood support, and again, in the centre shot at the bottom, collecting and processing seed ready for rehabilitation. So all of these images include materials that were harvested from mining leases, including the grasses, the coloured in those baskets and on the carving, are all natural dyes collected from plant products. So there's a number of opportunities to harvest materials ahead of mining. Native bees, and they can be established in beehives for local food consumption. The waxes are used for traditional uses for medicine, for making glues and other adhesives, for spears, fire sticks and other things. Bark collection can be from trees harvested for housing, or they can be bark harvested ahead of mine clearing. And in this centre image, that bark's being prepared the traditional way so that it can be utilised for paintings, and high value paintings are made on these bark materials. It's essentially a bark canvas, and they're sold for considerable sums to the art market. The other products include the bush products, which are soaps and skin products and other nutraceuticals. After the harvest of any useful products ahead of mine clearing, a better practice option is to then chip or grind all of the remaining vegetation, and then put that in stockpiles so it can weather and start to break down as a mulch and a soil enhancing product. And this is an image from the Gulkula mine where they've done exactly that. And then they've incorporated this biomass, this material, back in the soil to enhance the mine rehabilitation outcomes. As part of the training, capacity building and raising awareness process that IPAF is involved in, we developed some conceptual diagrams, and where we can, we engage Indigenous artists to help develop these materials, to show some of the principles and concepts about what a broader scale landscape may look like, and some of the potential impacts of mining, unauthorised use of traditional lands, and highlight the benefits of managing recreational activities of a significant number of mine workers, as an example. And if they're to undertake recreation on Indigenous lands, that they need to consider carrying weeds accidentally on their vehicles, lighting fires, only accessing authorised recreation areas to stop degrading the natural resources. There are many discussions within Indigenous and local communities with regard to what they want the environment to look like after mining. And this image is a representation of around 20 years of discussion with regard to that. So in summary, the general land uses include some options for livelihood generation from plantations of timber or other items that can be grown and sold for a value, some environmental plantings that may specifically target habitat for local plants or animals, and then cultural plantings that may include medicinal plants or food plants that have been traditionally used and impacted by mining. In addition, there's other infrastructure that people want on rehabilitation areas. These are images of Indigenous people and their participation in mine rehabilitation with those outcomes I just described. Again, an Indigenous owned and operated nursery producing plants for rehabilitation purposes. These images are in Suriname, and an example of rehabilitation. So you can see in that image that it was in the later part of the year 2000. This image was taken in 2018 or 19. And it's a demonstration of rehabilitation outcomes. On the left there, some of the areas weren't as successful as others. So there's work underway with IPAF members to enhance those rehabilitation outcomes to meet community expectations. These are some older images of rehabilitation on bauxite mines where government and the mining sector looked at post-mine land use options in support of mine closure, and they included forestry plantations of various species for timber production, local construction, jobs, etc. Other things that are explored in various places in Australia, Jamaica, and other places is to establish pasture on mine rehabilitation areas with some tree cover for cattle and other grazing support, again, for livelihoods. However, if that's not managed well, then you may get establishment of weeds, and that then causes all sorts of unintended consequences, such as catastrophic fires with some weed species. Mine rehabilitation, these are some images of mine rehabilitation, and to highlight the need that rehabilitated areas are a man-made landscape and they need management. After mine closure, there may be a need to manage these rehabilitation areas for some considerable time in the future for both maintenance of biodiversity values, species composition, forest structure, and other values. In the Australia context, that means managing fire, which is a positive contribution to biodiversity and other values if managed well. So we do have a number of initiatives where we provide information on the mineral exploration and mining process, and that includes backgrounds on what are the mineral resources, and in our case, bauxite is our focus, but the fact that in many jurisdictions, the government own all of the mineral resources, and in Australia, that's on all tenures. The other information we provide is some big picture information, such as the future pressure on natural resources, both above ground and below ground, is increasing, and that increasing pressure will also include the lands owned and managed by Indigenous people around the world. One thing that we do at ASI, we certainly acknowledge that local communities and Indigenous peoples have significant knowledge of their land, of their traditional lands, their cultural practices, and we value that information. And in order to build on that, we also share information and knowledge on the aluminium value chain. We raise awareness and build capacity, provide those training initiatives I mentioned earlier. And we talk about free, prior and informed consent methodologies and implementation. So we have a number of projects with IPAF members that we've supported that consider free, prior and informed consent and how that looks in various contexts in different jurisdictions. So we have a number of projects looking at providing this information through workshops. These workshops include interpretive support by specialists that can speak in multiple languages to help convey that information to Indigenous peoples and local communities and build their understanding of the sector, and in particular with mining, to understand some of those steps in the process. Even areas where mining has occurred for decades, there's still a poor understanding of the process, the decision-making pathways, what are the considerations of explorers, developers, and mining companies. And in general, a lot of these things have not been discussed or raised with communities over time. And that's why we focus on these sorts of discussions. So we talk about various elements of the bauxite exploration and mining process, and we give that background. We talk about those steps, and we then consider impact assessments, cultural heritage, sacred site protections, and we talk about agreements, mining agreements, exploration agreements. These are a couple of images of some of the workshops that we've been holding in Australia in the far north and in the very remote communities. And these communities, English is their second or third language. So these images include support by 2 Indigenous interpreters that speak multiple languages, and they play a key role in facilitating the community capacity building and awareness. This image includes 2 posters. One is explaining the bauxite exploration process, and the one on the right is the bauxite mining process. And we discuss each of these circles, which are key steps in the process. The government hand out permits for exploration on the top left. Then that requires talking with Indigenous peoples, subject to that agreement, and the methodology and the need to have observers and participants in exploration, get out and clear the tracks, undertake the drilling program, collect samples, send those to a lab for analysis. Should those resources prove to be beneficial, the quality of the bauxite sufficient, the quantity is there to consider developing a mine, then all the steps required for environmental impact assessments, social impact assessments, cultural impact assessments, the relevant mining agreements that may be associated with the development. These vary depending on the jurisdiction that is in play in various countries. We then talk about what is standard practice and what is a better practice, and the green circle and the red circle. The green circle, as I described earlier, about collecting all the resources, wood chipping the remainder to go back in the soil. Standard practice for the last 60 odd years is generally clear it, burn it, get it out of the way, mine the resource, put it on a truck, put it on a train, put it on a ship. Then the bottom middle image is again the mine footprint, and the bottom right is the rehabilitation of that mine site. So it's a very quick snapshot of the process. And we may talk about these things for a full day. Some of the workshops go a day and a half, and we might do that with 6 or 10 people or 50 people, depending on the location and the needs of that particular community. We're talking more and more about ecosystem services and some of these concepts, and how in some parts of the world, through various initiatives, those ecosystem services are becoming certified. And the ecosystem services include biodiversity, carbon, watershed protection, soil protection, cultural services, cultural values, and a number of other things that are considered ecosystem services. And for some of these, in particular carbon at the moment, but increasingly biodiversity, there are a number of initiatives that currently enable certification. And then people, entities, companies, and other stakeholders, including government in some jurisdictions, they pay for the management of such services. And we're looking at how that can support through sponsorship or payment of those services for local communities and Indigenous peoples to manage their lands for those identified ecosystem services. So we're looking at projects that consider how to provide evidence for that. What are the management arrangements? How can they be quantified and quantified? What are the frequency and costs of those management inputs? What's the baseline of the ecosystem services and the area in discussion? And how does that best work? I'll talk in a minute about you'll see on the slide the IPCIA methodology, which is a methodology developed by the Sámi people in Norway. So we'll go through that in a minute. This is some work that we did in partnership with a university in Australia, and we do various partnerships with universities. We've done so in India and Australia, the aim being to get those technical expertise to focus on specific questions or issues that may need further information, testing or teasing out. This particular one is looking at ecosystem services and how those forest livelihood supports, Indigenous employment, may be derived from ecosystem services. These are some images of Suriname, where IPAF members in Suriname are developing ecotourism opportunities in a forest area on their traditional land that is adjacent to an area that was mined. And this particular area where these images are was impacted by mining operations decades ago, with the blasting that scared off lots of the animals that the communities relied on for their food. So the communities are now coming back to these areas, and there was a whole lot of reasons why they left this particular region, but they're now coming back. And this project has been looking at establishing, and it has established, some ecotourism ventures that these communities are pursuing. And this was supported by the one of the foundations associated with one of the companies. This is an image in Norway where wind farms were established for the production of green energy, and with a positive intention to generate low carbon energy that could supply regional industry and communities. What was overlooked or neglected was the impact on traditional practices and local Indigenous communities by these wind farms, by fragmenting the landscape with roads and tracks to access the windmills, the actual windmills themselves, the physical infrastructure, the moving of the wind turbines, the noise generated from those, and also the electricity that was generated being transmitted through the lines. So the Sámi people wanted to quantify this and consider how this impacts on their landscape within all the other developments that have happened over time. So they developed a methodology, which is the Indigenous-led cumulative impact assessment on Indigenous cultural landscapes and traditional ecosystems. So it's a cumulative impact methodology which brings together a whole lot of disciplines, but through an Indigenous lens to describe, qualify and quantify what's happened on their traditional lands and how that impacts on those traditional practices. This methodology was discussed through IPAF, and the outcome was that the Sámi people updated this methodology and translated it into English as part of a discussion. And that discussion was triggered by the Sámi people speaking to IPAF and raising concerns about one of ASI certified entities purchasing energy from this wind farm, and what could we do to support them in reducing the impact of this actual energy supply. So we facilitated a discussion between the company and the Sámi people, and that's helped establish a very good relationship between the parties, and that discussion is ongoing. There's legal issues with the wind farm and the government and the courts in Norway. And in parallel to that, we talked about the cumulative impact assessment work. Out of that discussion, Indigenous IPAF members in India, with support from Sámi people, are applying that methodology in a couple of sites in India, one a 70-year-old bauxite mine, and the other a significant bauxite resource in the hill countries in Odisha, next to refinery and smelter infrastructure. So the aim being to better educate and inform the Indigenous peoples in this area, and to hear from them what their environment is like and what the current impacts are on those communities. This is some images of Guinea, and again some bauxite infrastructure and how it's overlaid on local communities' lands and farming regions. These are three of a series of posters developed by the Guinea research led by Dr. Penda Diallo that I mentioned earlier, and this will be subject to a more detailed webinar by Penda and others on the 17th of August. So I won't say any more other than this has been some very informative and insightful research that provided a voice to those local communities in Guinea. There's a couple of images here of a project undertaken by Settle Ghana, an NGO in Ghana, and they've done some very innovative work talking to communities in the regions around Ghana, that the savannah regions that are being impacted by bauxite mining activities, bauxite exploration, or are earmarked for those bauxite extraction activities. So it's called the Walking Together Initiative. This information and some of the other information that I'm discussing here is on the ASI website under the IPAF page. So if anyone wants further information, they're more than welcome to have a look at that. And I close with an image of a seagull. Too often governments, industry and others, they fly into communities, they make lots of noise, squawking and carrying on, leave some mess, and then fly off again. So this is to represent the fact that that occurs, and to bring to people's attention that there are better ways of engaging with communities that don't support being a seagull. So I'm just going to go back to the presentation and see if there's any questions that have popped up in the chat. How can I conduct interview with representatives of Indigenous communities without a journalist accreditation? So in response to that, you don't need to be a journalist to have discussions with Indigenous peoples or local communities. The key is to clearly articulate what questions you have and why you are asking those questions, and make sure that the questions are being asked in the local language, and be very clear the intent of your questioning and what the outcome will be. I believe that question was from an auditor, so presumably that's around an audit, and within the audit framework there are a list of principles and criteria, and no doubt that raises questions, so an auditor can tease out some feedback from communities on those respective criteria. So the guidance materials, as well as the criteria themselves, will help inform what sort of questions an auditor may ask. So the Secretariat Assurance team are also in a position to support framing some questions, should anyone have some. Next question is, will information learned during these workshops be shared with bauxite operators in local communities in an appropriate way? All of these workshops, webinars are recorded as we are right now, so those recordings can be shared with anyone. With regard to the workshops, if this question is referring to the workshops that we undertake, yes, those workshop information materials will increasingly be shared with ASI members, certified entities and other stakeholders as the materials are finalised and the communities that are involved in those workshops agree to share that information. So there's a question: does the moving of populations of Romani people included in the local Indigenous communities as well? That would need a more specific discussion. So if someone's got a specific question like that, there's a whole lot of context around that, and happy to have an offline discussion regarding that. So whoever asked that question, if you'd like to send an email, then we can organise a discussion to consider that question.
Just pop your email address into the chat, Mark.
Okay.
We do have a question in the Q&A box about the presentation. Mark, are you willing to share your presentation with the participants today?
Yes, we can do that as part of the process, yes. So I'm just putting my email there, so anyone can send me an email and we can have a yarn thereafter.
Yeah. Question for you, Mark. Can you give us some foreshadowing into projects that we have on the cusp that are on the radar or up and coming?
The cumulative impact assessment project that I mentioned for India, that's scheduled to be reported on this month. Once that report is finalised, the aim is for that to be reviewed. The Sámi representatives will include that review, ASI Secretariat and other IPAF members. And then once it's finalised and everybody's happy, we'll share that on our website. We're looking at another project to further test and refine that method in Australia, and we're hoping to get that underway in 2024. There's a number of other discussions to further support IPAF and IPAF members, and we're hoping to get some additional external funding to support work in Ghana, to support work in Guinea and Australia and other locations. In later 2023 and throughout 2024, we'll be undertaking a series of workshops in Guinea, and it's a train-the-trainer model where ASI Secretariat members, supported by local community representatives who are registered specialists with ASI, to build the capacity of the trainees, who can then deliver workshop materials and present those to Guinea local communities on an ongoing basis. The guidance for this project includes representatives from IPAF, mostly from Guinea, but those IPAF members from 3 other countries that can provide specialist skills, information and support for the Guinea workshops. So it's quite an exciting project, and looking at further building capacity within the communities in Guinea that are impacted by the aluminium value chain. So that's a couple of examples of projects that are underway and in play around the world.
And one last question. Do you see this kind of work going on in other standards, systems, as we are doing here?
I'm not aware of any other standards that are doing the depth and breadth of the work that we do at ASI, and we're able to do this because of the strong input from IPAF members and the really positive engagement of IPAF members from a number of countries. The network is a dynamic one, and there are members that are active for some time and then not so active other times. Yet everybody's part of the same network, and there's no requirement to participate in any particular way. But the members that engage in the meetings and so on, they're representatives of much larger communities or multiple communities in their various regions. So it's quite an extensive network once it branches out.
And do we see that network growing at the moment, or is it stable? What's that?
It is growing, and there's more members coming on, particularly in Guinea and Australia. But we welcome Indigenous people and local community representatives from any country and every country that may be impacted by the aluminium value chain. So if anyone listening to this webinar knows of any Indigenous peoples or local community representatives that may want to learn more about IPAF and ASI more broadly, then please share my email with them. Thanks everyone for participating, and anyone who hears this recording, happy listening.